Hello, this is Randy Rice of riceconsulting.com and Rice Consulting Services with another short video on some of the basic concepts and principles of software testing and software QA. So today's topic is there is a difference between testing and QA. Actually, I don't know really where the divergence began, when it happened. I recall in the early 90s, a little after I'd gotten into testing, uh, that it seemed like a lot of people were substituting the word QA for test. In fact, sometimes it gets really egregious where they'll say, they'll use QA as a verb. Now we're going to QA it, whatever it is. Now, in all honesty, there's no terminology police that's going to come out and correct you or anything, but it can actually make a difference when you're trying to hire, let's say, a QA manager. In fact, that did happen with one of my clients. They said, we just cannot find a good test management applicant. Everyone that's applying are all these general quality assurance kind of people, process people. So I asked them to send me their ad, and I would take a look at it and see if there's anything that I saw. Well, they were advertising for a QA manager, a software QA manager. And I said, just tweak that to software test manager and see what happens. And all of a sudden, they got all these great applicants for managing the test team. Actually, quality assurance is, I agree with what Kim Kainer says in the book, Lessons Learned in Software Testing, that really quality assurance doesn't assure anything. It's no guarantee, but the idea is that it's the management of quality, of the quality process. It's part of the quality picture. In fact, it's an essential part. It includes things like process definition, facilitation of testing. So you may be in more of a consulting role in terms of testing in your organization. It measures things, it establishes standards. So you might think of it as kind of like the old question, who's policing the police? Who's watching the police? Well, who's watching the testers would be QA. When I go into organizations and help them establish testing processes, one of the first questions I ask is, how will you know if people are actually following the process? And sometimes that's met with blank stares and very little, good answers for that. And that's the role of what a QA group would be doing. They would look for some kind of evidence that the defect rates were getting lower, that test defect fines were getting higher, those kind of things. Quality control is really what testing is. So testing is actually QC, because you're inspecting something, you're inspecting a product to find defects. So these two terms here are very key in terms of process going with QA and products going with QC, and your goal there is the same. And if you use that working definition, then it's not only testing that can be a form of QC, but also reviews and walkthroughs, inspections, those kind of things could be considered QC because they're helping you find defects. So think of QA as kind of like an umbrella over several things that we do in software quality. Testing being one of them, reviews being another, and you see on the slide here, you see QC by those. But also things like root cause analysis, so that we can do process improvement. Your goal is to understand what was the major single cause of the problem so that we can go back and improve processes. That's something QA would do. Testers could do that, but now you're not doing testing. And if QA is only doing testing, then there's no management. There's no real oversight of the process. QA also gets very involved in measurements and metrics, as we said, as well as process improvement. So one way to kind of see this is with a little analogy called the coffee pot analogy. I use this quite a bit in kind of illustrating what goes on in a process and why it's so hard to pull things out of something that's already been created, in this case a pot of coffee. So if you think about it, let's say we make a pot of coffee and something's gone wrong with the filtering process, and now we wind up with grounds in the coffee, which is not a desirable situation, especially if you really like good coffee. So we could solve the problem of grounds in the coffee by getting a pair of tweezers or something, or even worse, our fingers, because the coffee is hot, and randomly poking around in the pot of coffee, hoping we're going to find a ground, which in this case relates to a defect, and remove it. And so every ground of coffee that we find, we celebrate as a defect. We have found this and we put it over here to the side. And yes, that is improving the product because we're now reducing the number of grounds. But an interesting dynamic happens is that now the grounds are going to get harder to find because there's fewer of them. The density is less. Now, obviously that's an absurd way to solve the problem. A much better way to solve the problem would be to just simply pour the coffee through another filter. And if that doesn't work, pour it through another filter. I know I've done this in hotels many times, and sometimes I don't have a filter, so it's a paper towel or a napkin or something. And in fact, if you think about it, there's other solutions. Some people say, well, just drink the coffee as it is, wait for a minute, the grounds are going to settle to the bottom. I say, you must be a project manager or a product manager. Another solution is someone will say, well, you use instant coffee. Okay, that solves the problem of grounds, but then you have a taste and grounds trade-off there, perhaps. Some people say do something like a single cup brewer. Anyway, those are process solutions, and I think it's helpful to see that there's more solutions here than simply doing one thing. But think of testing and, in fact, defect removal in the larger sense as a filtration process. Now, this shows the risk, I believe, of having just one form of testing in a project. So let's say that you just have system testing. You only have one filter, and if you don't find the defects in that one filter, then they go right out to the customer. Let's say instead you have a series of filters, maybe unit testing, some reviews, system testing, UAT. Now you have more opportunities to find defects in different ways and by different people. I'll explore that in another video a little bit later. But the idea here is that QA is the function that kind of sets up and manages this whole filtration process. QC is the process, or testing is the process that actually looks into the product to find the flaws or to find the coffee grounds in this analogy. So I hope that kind of clarifies the difference between QA and QC. And like I say, you're not going to get in trouble by the terminology police, but sometimes you may encounter people who will use the terms in different ways than you're using them, and so it's really good to at least understand the clarification there. So this is Randy Rice with riceconsulting.com and Rice Consulting Services. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to have more information like this and perhaps find some training courses on software quality, software testing, come to my website at riceconsulting.com. Thanks for watching.